The first time I heard it, I thought I'd misheard. She's basically a trophy wife who's gotten stale. The sentence cut through the packed dining room like a knife. 1 second the air was champagne and applause, the next it was silence that didn't feel like silence, it felt like an audience holding its breath. My husband, Grant, stood dead center in Lumiere, his brand new luxury restaurant in Denver, surrounded by investors in tailored suits and women sparkling with jewelry that looked like it had its own lighting. He had his glass raised, smiling like he'd just landed the punchline of the year. The laughter that followed was hesitant, uneven, the kind people use when they're not sure if they're supposed to laugh or look away. I was 3 feet from him. 3 feet. Close enough to see the little flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. Close enough to smell the expensive cologne he liked, the one he said made him seem serious. Close enough that if I'd wanted to, I could have reached out and stopped him. I didn't. I stood there in the emerald dress he picked out for me that morning, hair styled exactly the way he preferred, lipstick in the shade he liked because it looked classy. My smile was in place like a piece of decor, something curated to match the room. My name is Natalie, and I'm 29 years old. And until that moment, right there under the warm chandelier glow and the soft music and the clinking glasses, I believed my marriage was built on love and partnership. I believed the 13-year age gap between us was just a number, not a warning label. I believed his experience and my youth balanced each other, that we made each other better. I believed a lot of things. They shattered the second he said that word, like crystal hitting marble. Grant turned toward me, still soaking in everyone's attention, like the whole room existed to admire him. He reached into his jacket pocket. For one stupid, tender second, my brain tried to make it a gift. A note. A thank you. Something that acknowledged the woman who had poured nearly everything into making this night possible. Instead, he pulled out an envelope. Thick. White. Heavy with purpose. Since we're making announcements tonight, he said, voice smooth in that practiced way he used. When he wanted to sound important, I figured I'd handle this, too. Natalie, sweetheart, I'm filing for divorce. The words didn't just land, they echoed. My lawyer drew up the papers last week, he went on, like he was explaining a business decision. You get it, right? A man in my position needs someone who can keep up with the image. The room went still. Not kind still, not concerned still, just hungry. The kind of quiet people get when they realize they're watching something they'll retell for months. I could feel eyes on me from every angle. They wanted tears. A scene. Something messy to season their night. I gave them nothing. I reached out, took the envelope from his fingers, and my face stayed composed, like my skin had been trained to hold everything in. Years in his world taught me how to mask, how to smile while I was breaking, how to keep my posture elegant when something inside me was screaming. Thank you for letting me know, I said, and my voice came out so even it shocked me. I appreciate the clarity. His smile twitched, just for a second. He'd expected me to beg. He'd expected a public collapse so he could play the patient husband dealing with an emotional wife. Instead, I took that moment from him. I turned and walked toward the exit. My heels clicked against the polished floor with each step, steady as a metronome. Behind me, Grant tried to restart the party. His laugh was too loud, his voice too bright, like he could force the room back into celebration if he talked fast enough. The valet pulled my car around. I drove home in silence with the divorce papers unopened on the passenger seat. The Denver skyline glittered in my rearview mirror, gorgeous and cold and completely indifferent to what just happened to me. I had walked into that restaurant as his wife, his partner, the woman who believed in a future with him at the center. I left as something else. When I pulled into the driveway of our house, the house I helped buy with my inheritance, I sat there for nearly 20 minutes with the engine off. Hands on the steering wheel like if I let go, I might float away. My chest felt tight, like invisible bands around my ribs, pulling tighter. With every breath. But I didn't cry. Not yet. There's a kind of crying you don't do in front of people who would use it against you. I learned that young. The word that kept looping in my head was stale. Not old. Not tired. Stale. Like bread you toss out. Like something that had served its purpose and now offended the senses. I was 29. And my husband had already decided I was past my expiration date. The cruel part, the part that made my stomach churn, was that everything around him, the restaurant, the investors, the applause, the glossy future he was selling tonight, it existed because of me. My money, my connections, my belief in him when no one else was taking him seriously. Grant wasn't celebrating his dream. He was celebrating what my resources built for him. And he had the nerve to discard me like I was a worn accessory. That realization didn't just hurt. It rearranged something inside me. It turned love into a cold, sharp understanding. But before I could do anything with that understanding, I had to face the question that kept showing up like a bruise: how did I end up here? I met Grant 4 years earlier when I was 25 and he was 38. At the time, I worked as a financial analyst at a private equity firm. I was good, not for my age good, not for a woman good, just good. I'd graduated near the top of my class and I was already carving out a name in rooms full of men who assumed I was there to take notes. I wasn't naive. I wasn't wide-eyed and clueless. I was ambitious, sharp, financially independent. And I had money. 2 years before I met him, my grandmother passed away. She wasn't just my grandmother, she was my parent in all the ways that mattered. My parents died in a car accident when I was 7, and she raised me with a kind of tough love that didn't break you, it built you. She also built a small empire, smart investments, careful planning, decades of refusing to be careless. When she died, she left everything to me. Her only grandchild. A little over $3 million. Life-changing money. I didn't blow it. I didn't go wild. I spent 2 years learning how to manage it, how to protect it, how to make it grow. I heard her voice every time I looked at a statement, reminding me that money is only power if you understand it. When Grant and I crossed paths, he owned a small bistro downtown. It was the kind of place that tried hard, decent food, good lighting, a little too loud, but charming enough. I'd stopped in for lunch on a brutal workday, looking for a corner where I could breathe and review documents without being surrounded by office noise. He noticed me immediately, at least that's what he later claimed. The woman sitting alone with spreadsheets and a focused face, like she was building something inside her head. He came over, asked what I was working on, and listened like he cared. He made a joke that actually landed. I laughed for the first time in weeks, a real laugh, not the polite one you use with coworkers. When he asked for my number, I gave it to him without hesitation. Looking back, I don't know if that was the first mistake, or if the mistakes came later, stacked so neatly on top of each other that I didn't notice the foundation weakening until it cracked. Our dating was intense in that way that feels like fate. Grant knew how to make a woman feel chosen. Dates that felt spontaneous but were clearly planned. Flowers sent to my office. Little details remembered and repeated weeks later, like proof I mattered. He pulled me into his world of food and hospitality like it was magic. He talked about flavors like they were emotions. He made me feel like my life had been too serious before him, like he was adding color. 6 months after we met, he proposed. 6 months. I can say it now and hear how fast it was. I can feel the part of me that wants to rewind and sit my younger self down and ask her why she was rushing. But at the time, I thought I'd found something rare. Someone who saw me. Someone who made grief feel lighter. Someone who looked at me like I was not just capable, but precious. So I said yes. We married in a small ceremony. Close friends, his business associates. I wore a simple white dress my grandmother would have loved. He wore a suit that cost more than my first car. We honeymooned in Italy, and on that trip he talked endlessly about his dream, opening a luxury restaurant that would put Denver on the map. That dream required money. Real money. The kind he didn't have. And here's the part that still makes my throat tighten, he never asked outright. Not at first. He just painted the picture. He described the space, the ambience, the menu, the reputation. He talked about it like it was already real, and he waited. I offered. I offered because I thought we were a team. Because I loved him. Because I believed in building something together. He acted surprised, grateful, like I'd rescued him. He promised my investment would come back tenfold. He promised partnership. He promised that everything he built would belong to both of us. And I wanted to believe him so badly that I did. So I transferred $7 million into the business account that would eventually become Lumiere. For 3 years, I watched my money turn into something beautiful. Contractors, designers, tasting menus, decor choices, meetings I sat through and helped shape. I wasn't just a silent investor. I was present. Active. Involved. I reviewed projections. I offered insights. I caught mistakes before they became disasters. But somewhere in the final stretch, something shifted. As the restaurant got closer to completion, Grant's need for my input faded. Meetings started happening without me. Decisions got made without my knowledge. If I asked questions, he'd smile and tell me not to worry, that he was handling it, that I should focus on looking stunning for the opening. Looking stunning. That should have been my alarm bell. Instead, I told myself he was stressed. I told myself it would go back to normal after the launch. I told myself love meant patience. And then came the grand opening. I walked into Lumiere that night nervous and excited, ready to celebrate 3 years of work and sacrifice. Grant had been distant in the days leading up to it, but I blamed pressure. I had no idea he'd spent that time talking to lawyers, preparing divorce papers, rehearsing how to humiliate me in front of strangers. Now, sitting in our driveway with the envelope still unopened, I finally let the truth settle in. I trusted him with my heart and my money. And he decided I wasn't worth keeping. What Grant didn't understand, what he never bothered to learn, was that I wasn't just a pretty wife he could parade around. I wasn't just funding. I was the granddaughter of a woman who survived, built, and taught me how to protect myself even when I was in love. Grant thought he could embarrass me and walk away with everything, leaving me too shocked to fight back. He thought I'd sign and disappear. He was about to learn what happens when you mistake a woman's quiet for weakness. That night, after the driveway silence finally stopped feeling like it was choking me, I walked into the house and went straight to my office. It was the one room Grant rarely stepped into. He always said numbers made his head hurt, like it was a cute personality trait instead of a warning. The truth was, anything that required careful attention bored him unless it was his reflection in a mirror or a room full of people praising him. I shut the door behind me, sat at my desk, and slid the envelope onto the blotter like it was evidence. For a second, I just stared at it. Not because I was afraid of the words, but because opening it felt like accepting that the life I thought I had was already gone. I didn't open it yet. Instead, I opened my laptop. My hands were shaking, but my mind was sharp in a way I hadn't felt in months, maybe years. It was like something inside me, something that had been forced to sleep to keep the peace, had finally sat up and looked around. I pulled up every file connected to Lumiere. Every contract, every agreement, every email thread. I didn't do it to hurt him. Not at first. I did it because I needed to understand what I was actually standing on. And within minutes, I felt something cold settle into my stomach. Because there it was, plain as day. My $7 million wasn't a gift. It was structured as a loan. A formal loan, drafted by attorneys I hired, with terms clear enough to make even a distracted man pay attention if he'd bothered to read them. It could be called due with 30 days' notice. And if the business failed to repay, the agreement allowed immediate legal action, including seizure of assets. I remembered signing those documents. I remembered the way my attorney had explained them calmly, like she was talking to someone who loved too hard and needed a safety net. I remembered smiling and thinking, I'll never need this. Grant signed without hesitation. He barely skimmed. He was too busy being flattered that I believed in him. Too busy imagining the life he wanted. Too sure I would never do anything that made him uncomfortable. He assumed love meant I would always protect him. Tonight, love hadn't protected me. Tonight, love hadn't stopped him from calling me stale in front of investors like I was a prop that had aged out. The calm I'd been holding snapped just enough for tears to blur my vision. But even while I cried, I felt something else underneath it. A kind of clarity I couldn't unsee. Grant had made a public decision. He wanted me humiliated. He wanted me quiet. He wanted me out of the way, and he wanted my money to stay where it was, holding his dream up while he replaced me with someone newer. He wanted consequences-free cruelty. I wiped my face, inhaled slowly, and picked up my phone. My attorney's name was Elise. She'd helped my grandmother with estate planning for years, and after my grandmother passed, she became the person I trusted most with my financial world. She wasn't sentimental. She didn't get distracted by charm. She saw the structure beneath the story. It was nearly 11 at night. I still called. She answered on the second ring, and before I even spoke, I could hear the shift in her tone, that quiet alertness that said she knew this wasn't a casual call. "Elise," I said, and my voice came out steady, which surprised me. "I need you to initiate the loan recall on the Lumiere investment. All to $7 million. Tonight." There was a pause, not because she didn't understand, but because she did. "Natalie," she said carefully, "are you certain? Once we start this, we can't undo it. The restaurant won't survive that kind of withdrawal right now." I pictured Grant's smile. The way the room laughed, unsure, but still laughing. The envelope in his hand like I was being served paperwork instead of respect. "I'm certain," I said. "Send the notice tonight. I want it in his hands by morning." Another pause, then her voice, calm, sharp, decisive. "Understood. I'll send it immediately." When the call ended, I sat there in the dark with only the laptop glow lighting my face. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you realize how much of your life has been filled with someone else's noise. The tears came again, but differently this time. Not the dramatic kind. Silent, hot, and private. I cried for the version of me who had loved him with her whole chest. I cried for the woman who thought being chosen meant being safe. I cried for the part of me that had shrunk to fit into his image. And then, slowly, that crying stopped. Not because it didn't hurt, but because something stronger was rising under the pain. For years, I had defined myself as Grant's wife. His partner. His supporter. I had poured money, time, and emotional energy into his dream because I wanted to build a legacy with him. Somewhere along the way, I stopped building my own life and started living inside his. Tonight snapped me out of it. Not with romance, not with closure, not with some soft talk. With humiliation. And the strangest part was, the humiliation didn't crush me the way he expected. It woke me up. I didn't sleep that night. I worked. Not in a frantic way, but in a methodical way that felt like stepping back into my own body. I opened every account. Every asset list. Every legal document tied to our marriage. I highlighted what was mine. I separated what was shared. I noted what could be contested. By the time the first pale light touched the sky over the mountains, I had something I hadn't had in a long time. A clear picture. The house was in my name. Purchased before we married with inheritance funds. The cars were in my name, too. I'd insisted because it was easier for insurance and paperwork, and Grant never argued because he didn't care about details that didn't flatter him. The investment accounts my grandmother set up, untouched. Protected. Separate. And then there was the prenuptial agreement. I found it in the folder labeled estate, the one I kept organized like my grandmother taught me. I remember bringing it up before our wedding. I remember the way Grant laughed, like it was adorable that I was being serious. I remember him saying, "Of course, sweetheart, whatever makes you comfortable," like he was indulging a child with a blanket. He signed it without reading it properly. Again. Because he never believed I would use it. He assumed marriage meant what was mine became his. He assumed wrong. When the sun rose fully, I showered. Not for him, not to look perfect, but because I needed to feel clean. I put on comfortable clothes, not something decorative. I made coffee and sat outside on the patio, watching the city wake up like nothing had changed. It was strange, how normal the world looked when your life had just split in half. At exactly 8 a.m., Elise sent the loan recall notice to Lumiere's registered business address. Grant would see it within hours. And when he did, his world would tilt. My phone started ringing at 9:15. Grant's name flashed across the screen. Bright. Bold. Like he still belonged in my space. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 9:17. Again at 9:19. Again at 9:22. I watched the screen light up and go dark like a pulse I refused to answer. By 10 o'clock, there were 8 missed calls and multiple voicemails. I listened to the first one. Confusion. "Natalie, I just received something from your attorney. Call me back. This has to be a mistake." The second was irritation. "I don't know what game you're playing, but this isn't funny." The third was anger. "You think you can do this to me? After everything I've done for you?" By the 7th voicemail, the anger had cracked into panic. "Natalie, please. We need to talk. I didn't mean what I said last night. I was nervous, I said something stupid. Just call me. We can work this out. Work this out." The words almost made me laugh, but it wasn't humor. It was disbelief. Because the night before, he didn't treat me like someone you work things out with. He treated me like a product he was returning. I deleted the voicemails one by one. Not to be petty. To be free. Grant believed he knew me. For 4 years, he looked at me and saw what he wanted: a young wife, a polished accessory, a wallet with a heartbeat, someone who would smile and keep quiet. He never saw the person behind the role. He never saw the woman my grandmother raised. That day, I made phone calls of my own. I scheduled an emergency therapy appointment. I called a locksmith to change the locks. I contacted Elise for next steps. I made a list of mutual friends I trusted and mutual friends I didn't. I started building a wall between my life and the man who thought he could rearrange me like furniture. By early afternoon, Grant's calls were relentless. 18 missed calls. Then 20. Then more. I finally listened to the newest voicemail, mostly to measure how deep his panic had gotten. "Natalie, the investors are calling. They're asking about the funding. They're talking about pulling out. You're going to destroy everything we built together. Is that what you want? Everything we built together." That phrase hit like a slap. Because what we built together, what I built, was not a restaurant. It was an illusion that love would make someone decent. And now that illusion was gone. The investors started pulling back the same afternoon. I didn't even need to be there to feel it happening. Business circles move fast, especially when the rumor is money is shaky. Grant had sold Lumiere a stable, fully backed, a sure bet. Now the biggest supporter was withdrawing. And the people who had clapped and toasted and smiled at me the night before were suddenly doing what investors do best. Protecting themselves. Grant was about to learn something my grandmother taught me early, something he never understood. Money doesn't just build dreams. It reveals character when it moves. By the end of that first week, Grant stopped calling in anger and started calling in desperation. I didn't need to answer to feel the shift. It showed up in the timing, the gaps between calls shrinking, the voicemails losing their edge and gaining a tremor. Elise kept me updated without commentary, just facts delivered with professional calm. Two investors had formally pulled out. One vendor had demanded immediate payment. Another was threatening legal action. The landlord of the building housing Lumiere had requested an emergency meeting. The restaurant hadn't even finished its first full week. Grant had built his confidence on the assumption that my support was permanent. That assumption was cracking, and he was scrambling to glue it back together. Part of me felt something like guilt. Not because of him, but because of the staff. The chefs who worked 12-hour days. The servers who smiled through exhaustion. The hosts who memorized names and preferences because they took pride in what they were building. They didn't deserve to be collateral damage. But then another part of me, quieter and firmer, reminded me of something important. I wasn't destroying the restaurant. I was removing myself from a structure built on disrespect. Grant had other options. He could find investors. He could downscale. He could be honest. What he couldn't do anymore was rely on my silence. On the third day, Grant stopped calling and started showing up. The first time, I saw his car pull into the driveway through the upstairs window. He sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel like he was bracing himself. Then he got out, suit wrinkled, hair less controlled than usual, and marched to the door like he still owned the place. He knocked hard. Not polite. Not patient. I didn't answer. He knocked again, louder. Then he started calling my name through the door like volume would make me appear. I watched from behind the curtain, heart steady, noting how quickly frustration replaced entitlement on his face. Eventually, he left. An hour later, he came back with flowers, holding them like a peace offering, like something symbolic could undo what he'd done. I didn't open the door then either. I called the police instead. When the officers arrived, Grant was still standing on the porch, bouquet drooping, trying to explain that it was a misunderstanding between spouses. They escorted him to his car and warned him not to return without permission. He returned anyway. 5 more times that week. Each visit chipped away at whatever illusion I still had about who he was. This wasn't love. This wasn't remorse. This was control slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to exist without it. I documented everything. Dates. Times. Voicemails. Messages. Elise told me calmly that this would matter later. The insult at the opening wasn't just about humiliation. It was about certainty. Grant was certain I would absorb it. Certain I would stay. Certain I wouldn't fight back. He had never considered that I might have a limit. And now that he'd crossed it, he couldn't uncross it. By the second week, the fallout was accelerating. Lawsuits started appearing like cracks in glass. Investors claiming misrepresentation. Vendors demanding payment Grant had promised but never secured. The restaurant world is smaller than it pretends to be, and word spread fast. Grant's image as the confident visionary unraveled. People started asking questions. The same people who'd toasted him were suddenly careful with their words. Elise called me on day 14 and asked me to come into her office. She laid everything out on the desk between us, documents neatly stacked, tabs labeled, numbers highlighted. She'd seen everything over her career, but even she looked tired on my behalf. The loan recall is proceeding as expected, she said. Grant hasn't paid anything. His lawyers are asking for extensions, citing hardship, but the agreement is airtight. He signed it. And the divorce? I asked. She exhaled. His initial filing was ambitious. He wanted you to walk away with almost nothing while retaining full ownership of the business you funded. I laughed once, short and humorless. I filed a counterclaim that reflects reality, she continued. He's furious. I met her eyes. I imagine. She hesitated, then leaned back slightly. Natalie, I need to ask this. Are you sure you want to proceed this way? Pulling the investment, contesting the divorce. There are quieter paths. Some people prefer to settle and move on. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't know, but because I wanted my words to be honest. He called me stale in front of 50 people, I said finally. He handed me divorce papers at our celebration. He used my money and my loyalty for years while planning to discard me. I'm not interested in quiet. I'm interested in him understanding exactly what he lost. She nodded slowly, something like respect in her eyes. Then we proceed. The weeks that followed were relentless. Grant tried everything. He sent mutual friends to plead his case, framing himself as misunderstood, pressured, heartbroken. He had his mother call me, sobbing about how I was ruining her son's life. He tried to send flowers to my office, which security intercepted and returned unopened. Each attempt felt less like reconciliation and more like panic dressed up as regret. And through all of it, something surprising happened. I stopped feeling angry. Not because what he did was forgivable, but because anger requires emotional investment. And mine was draining away. What replaced it was something steadier. Self-respect. Revenge would have meant wanting him to hurt the way I hurt. Wanting him to suffer. This wasn't that. This was me refusing to minimize myself to keep him comfortable. This was me choosing to stand fully in my own life, even if it meant watching his fall from a distance. The divorce papers he gave me that night stayed unsigned in a drawer. Instead, my own paperwork was prepared. Papers that reflected the truth. Papers that detailed what I brought into the marriage, what I funded, what I protected. Before I filed them, though, I knew there was one last thing I needed. Not closure. Not forgiveness. Clarity. I needed to see his face when he finally understood. So I sent him a text. 5 words. Come to the house tonight. His reply came seconds later. I'll be there at 7. I set my phone down and felt something settle in my chest. Not fear. Not excitement. Finality. Grant arrived exactly at 7. He always cared about punctuality when it served him. I watched from the window as he checked his reflection in the car mirror, straightened his tie, tried to assemble the version of himself he thought still worked. It didn't. He looked exhausted. Hollowed out. The confidence he wore like armor had dents all over it. I opened the door before he knocked. Natalie, he said, relief rushing into his voice like he thought this was the beginning of a rescue. Thank you for seeing me. Please, can we talk like adults? I stepped aside and let him in. Not because he deserved it, but because I wanted him to stand inside a life he thought he could take from me. We sat across from each other in the living room. The same couch he used to sprawl on like the world belonged to him. The chair my grandmother gave me when I graduated, solid and unassuming. He started talking immediately, launching into apologies that sounded practiced. Pressure. Stress. A joke that went wrong. A divorce filing he claimed was a mistake. I listened without interrupting. When he finally paused, waiting for my response, I stood up, walked to my desk, and returned with a stack of papers. What I need, I said, placing them in front of him, is for you to sign these. He looked down, color draining from his face as he read. This is insane, he said. You're asking for everything. I'm asking for what's mine. He started pacing, anger flickering through panic. You're destroying my life's work out of spite. You destroyed it the moment you decided I was disposable. He stared at me, really stared, like he was finally seeing someone he didn't recognize. You've changed, he said. No, I replied calmly. I stopped shrinking. He threatened. He pleaded. He tried shame. None of it landed. Finally, his shoulders slumped. He signed. His hand shook as he wrote his name. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door. You'll regret this. I know exactly what I'm giving up, I said. And exactly what I'm gaining. He left without looking back. And for the first time since that night at the restaurant, I felt something close to peace. The house felt different after he left. Not emptier. Quieter, yes, but not hollow. It felt like a space that had finally stopped holding its breath. I stood by the window for a long moment after Grant's car disappeared down the street. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant either. What I felt was something steadier, like the end of a long internal argument I didn't realize I'd been having for years. It was over. Not just the marriage. The version of myself that kept bending to keep someone else standing. The weeks that followed were full, but not chaotic. There was paperwork, meetings, phone calls, signatures. Legal language replacing emotional language. Facts replacing excuses. Elise handled most of it with her usual precision, updating me without drama. The divorce moved quickly. Grant wanted it finished just as badly as I did, though for different reasons. He wanted distance from the evidence. I wanted distance from him. I got the house. The accounts. The assets I brought in. The freedom. He got the restaurant. And the debt that came with it. Lumiere lasted 3 months. 3 months from grand opening to quiet closure. No dramatic announcement. No farewell dinner. Just a locked door, a notice taped to the glass, and unanswered calls from creditors who had finally accepted the truth. Grant tried to save it. He sold what he could. Took out loans he couldn't afford. Even launched a crowdfunding campaign that barely raised enough to cover a fraction of what he owed. The same charm that once filled rooms couldn't compete with numbers on a spreadsheet. The investors were done believing. The industry moved on without him. I heard pieces of it through friends of friends, the way news travels when you're no longer directly connected. Lawsuits. Credit ruined. A move out of state. A restart that wasn't really a restart so much as survival. The man who called me stale was now scrambling to stay afloat. I didn't celebrate it. Not because he didn't deserve consequences, but because his collapse wasn't my victory. My victory was quieter. It showed up in small, unexpected ways. The first morning I made breakfast without rushing. The first weekend I spent hiking without checking my phone. The first time I laughed without wondering if it was appropriate or attractive or useful. Fiona stayed close. She checked in daily at first, then weekly, then in that easy rhythm real friendships fall into when they don't have to prove anything. She dragged me to dinners, to movies, to long walks where we talked about everything and nothing. She reminded me who I was before I became someone's accessory. I downsized. Sold the house that had always felt like a showroom more than a home. Bought a smaller place in a quieter neighborhood where no one cared who I was married to or how much money I had. It felt like choosing myself without explanation. I invested differently this time. Carefully. Intentionally. With people who respected my input instead of tolerating it. With businesses that didn't require me to disappear to succeed. I also started volunteering. A mentorship program for young women entering finance. Women who reminded me of myself at 25, smart, driven, hopeful, unaware of how often confidence is mistaken for availability. I didn't tell them my whole story. I didn't need to. I taught them what my grandmother taught me. Read everything. Protect yourself. Trust your instincts. Love doesn't require erasure. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into one of the investors from the opening night at a coffee shop downtown. She recognized me immediately, her expression curious, not hostile. "I've always wondered," she said, lowering her voice. "That night, when he said those things, did you already have a plan?" I thought about it before answering. "I didn't have a plan," I said. "I had clarity. Once I saw him clearly, everything else followed." She nodded, slow and thoughtful. "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing." I thanked her, not because I needed her approval, but because it felt good to accept kindness without suspicion. 2 years later, I rarely think about Grant. When I do, it isn't with anger. It's with a strange neutrality, like remembering a road I once took that no longer leads anywhere. I think instead about transformation. About how close I came to believing his version of me. About how easy it would have been to sign his papers, walk away quietly, and let his definition of my worth become permanent. I didn't. And that choice changed everything. The revenge was never the point. The real win was remembering I never needed anyone else to confirm my value for it to exist. The strangest thing about healing is that it doesn't announce itself. There was no moment where I woke up and thought, I'm fine now. No clean line between broken and whole. It happened quietly, in pieces so small I almost missed them. Like the day I realized I hadn't checked Grant's social media in months. Or the afternoon I caught myself humming while organizing files at work, not because I was forcing optimism, but because I felt light. Unburdened. Present. My therapist once told me that betrayal doesn't just break trust in other people, it fractures trust in yourself. You replay decisions, conversations, red flags you ignored. You wonder how someone intelligent, capable, experienced could have ended up somewhere so painful. For a long time, that question haunted me. How did I not see it? But eventually, the question changed. Not how did I miss it, but why was I taught to ignore my discomfort in the first place? That shift mattered more than anything. Because the truth was, the signs were always there. They just didn't look dramatic enough to justify leaving. The way Grant interrupted me when I talked about work. The way my ideas were interesting but his were brilliant. The way my money was practical but his vision was genius. The way I was praised most when I was quiet, agreeable, decorative. I didn't miss those things. I minimized them. And that wasn't because I was weak. It was because I was taught that love meant accommodation, patience, softness at any cost. Unlearning. That took time. After the divorce, my career shifted in ways I didn't expect. Not upward in a flashy sense, but deeper. I stopped chasing validation. I spoke more directly in meetings. I stopped apologizing before stating facts. I noticed something interesting when I did that. People listened. Not because I became louder, but because I became clearer. Opportunities followed. Consulting offers. Board seats. Partnerships with people who didn't feel threatened by competence. People who didn't need to feel bigger by making me smaller. For the first time in years, my work felt like mine again. Emotionally, I rebuilt slower. I didn't date for a long time. Not out of fear, but out of respect for myself. I wanted to know who I was without shaping myself around someone else's expectations. I spent evenings reading on the couch. Weekends hiking alone. Mornings journaling with coffee while the city woke up outside my window. It wasn't loneliness. It was space. And in that space, I found myself again. Not the woman Grant married. Not the polished version designed to complement someone else's ambition. But the woman my grandmother raised. Curious. Analytical. Warm, but not self-sacrificing. Capable of love without disappearing into it. Every now and then, someone would ask about him. Carefully. Like they were afraid of stepping on a scar. How's your ex, they'd say. And I'd answer honestly. I don't know. And I didn't. Because his story no longer intersected with mine. The last concrete update I heard came through a mutual acquaintance about a year after the restaurant closed. Grant was working long shifts at a chain restaurant in another city. Not managing. Cooking. Starting over at the bottom. There was a time when that information would have sparked something sharp in me. Satisfaction. Vindication. Anger dressed up as justice. Instead, it landed quietly. Not because I felt sorry for him. But because I felt done. The irony wasn't lost on me, though. The man who called me stale had built his life on borrowed resources and burned through them without care. When those resources were gone, there was nothing left to prop him up. Rust doesn't come from age. It comes from neglect. 2 years after that night at the opening, I was asked to speak at a small event for young professionals in finance. the topic was risk. Not numbers. Not markets. People. I stood at the front of the room, looking at faces that reminded me so much of my younger self it almost hurt. Ambitious. Hopeful. Confident, but still learning where confidence could get them hurt. I didn't tell them my whole story. I didn't need to. I said this instead. Being capable doesn't protect you from being used. Loving deeply doesn't mean loving blindly. And walking away doesn't mean you failed, it means you paid attention. Afterward, a young woman approached me. She hesitated, then asked quietly, "How did you know when to stop trying?" I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "When I realized the cost of staying was my self-respect." She nodded like something clicked. And in that moment, I understood something important. What happened to me wasn't just a personal reckoning. It was a lesson I could pass on without bitterness. Without revenge. Without shame. Because the real ending to my story wasn't Grant's downfall. It was my return. To myself. There's a strange peace that comes when a story fully settles. Not when it fades, but when it finds its place in you and stops demanding attention. Years after everything happened, I can still remember that night in perfect detail. The lights. The laughter that didn't quite land. The word that sliced through the room and changed the trajectory of my life. But remembering it no longer pulls me backward. It feels more like looking at a photograph from a distance, clear, contained, no longer dangerous. That's how I know I've moved on. Not because I forgot, but because I integrated it. I stopped asking myself what I should have done differently. I stopped rewriting conversations in my head, imagining sharper responses or earlier exits. That version of control is an illusion. You can't rewrite the past without erasing the person you became because of it. And I like who I became. I learned something that night that no book, no mentor, no success ever taught me as clearly. Being chosen is not the same as being respected. Being admired is not the same as being valued. And being loved should never require shrinking yourself to stay. For a long time, I thought strength looked like endurance. Like staying calm. Like absorbing discomfort gracefully. I thought maturity meant tolerating things quietly and calling it understanding. Now I know better. Real strength looks like discomfort. With dignity. It looks like choosing yourself even when it costs you a life you once wanted. It looks like walking away without turning cruelty into your own personality. I didn't win because Grant lost. I won because I didn't lose myself. The most ironic part of the whole story is this. The night he called me stale, he believed he was defining me. He thought he was setting the narrative, placing me into a box he could discard. What he actually did was expose his own fear. Fear of a woman who didn't need him. Fear of a partner who saw through him. Fear of losing control. That fear was never mine to carry. I see women now who remind me of who I was. Smart, capable, generous with their love and their resources. Women who excuse small dismissals because they don't want to seem difficult. Women who tell themselves it's just stress, just pressure, just one bad moment. I don't interrupt them. I don't lecture. I don't warn. I just say this, quietly. Pay attention to how you feel when you're alone with someone. Not how impressive they are. Not how charming they seem. But how much of yourself you're allowed to bring into the room. Because love that requires silence isn't love. And partnership that demands erasure isn't partnership. If my story has any purpose beyond my own growth, it's this. You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You don't have to be cruel to be strong. And you don't have to wait for someone else to validate your worth. You already know it. Sometimes, all it takes is one moment of clarity to remember.